Welcome, everybody. We will get started at noon, right on the dot. And we are streaming to YouTube live at JCW Program. And this webinar is also being recorded. We'll start in just a few moments. Welcome to our second Writer in Residence event as part of the Journalism Creative Writing program. We are pleased to bring you Thoughts for the Times, War and Beyond. So this is part of our Journalism Creative Writing collaborative program between Durham College Journalism Program, and you'll see our students in the Chronicle newsroom. They can give us a wave, so thank you for joining us. So those students are currently at Durham College, and our collaborative Journalism Creative Writing program is with Durham College's Journalism Program and Trent University's Media Studies program with an option in creative writing. So before we begin, I would like to let you know we are streaming on YouTube. We are also recording this webinar, and I would like to turn it to Ganga to give us a land acknowledgement. Ganga is one of our Journalism Creative Writing students, and she's currently in her second year of the program.
Before we start today, I would like to take this opportunity to take a moment to acknowledge and connect with the land that we are on. I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation under the Williams Treaty. We owe an important debt of gratitude to the original stewards and caretakers of these lands. We all should be willing to not only learn but grow our knowledge of the land in which we are educated. This should be done by listening to diverse and Indigenous voices. Each and every one of us here in attendance has an important role to play in protecting the land in which we live and learn. As an international student from India studying in Canada, I have been exposed in a whole new world of education and culture. Being away from home has been a challenging but exciting experience, and I have learned a lot about myself and the world around me. Through my coursework at both Durham College and Trent University, I have had the opportunity to learn about the rich history and culture of Indigenous people from Canada. I'm learning about their traditions, stories, and spiritual beliefs and how they have been impacted by colonialism and the ongoing struggles of recognition and rights. One thing that stood out to me is the significance of drum circle in Indigenous learning and culture in Canada. Coming from India, where music plays an essential role in various cultural traditions, I was curious to learn more about the significance of drum circles and how they are used in Indigenous learning. As part of my course, I had the opportunity to witness a drum circle and learn about its importance in Indigenous culture. I learned that drumming is an essential part of Indigenous ceremonies, and the drum itself represents the heartbeat of Mother Earth. The beat of the drum creates a sense of unity and connection among participants, and it is believed that the vibration of the drum carry prayers to the Creator.
Thank you so much, Ganga, for our land acknowledgement. I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Ihor Junik, who is going to contextualize this event for us. So I'd like to invite Ihor to the screen. Thanks so much, Ihor.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Ihor Junik, and I'm a professor of cultural studies and English literature at Trent, and the co-coordinator of the Journalism and Creative Writing program. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our event this afternoon. Особливо хочу привітати наших гостей з України. Я знаю, що ви приєдналися до нас у дуже складних обставинах. Ми дуже раді, що ви тут. І сподіваємося, що сьогоднішня дискусія буде для вас цікавою та корисною. Our event today is a conversation between Irina Starovoit, in her second appearance as the Journalism and Creative Writing program's virtual writer-in-residence, and Andrew Wernick, and is titled Thoughts for the Times, The War and Beyond. Thoughts for the Times is going to be an annual lecture organized by the Journalism and Creative Writing program, and I'm thrilled to have two such distinguished speakers to inaugurate the event. The title of the series, Thoughts for the Times, is taken from Sigmund Freud's important essay of 1915 titled Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. By the second decade of the 20th century, Freud had begun to attract global attention for his psychoanalysis, a new discipline that presented a radical and challenging picture of the human mind and human nature. To this point, much of Freud's writing was derived from clinical experience and was devoted to mapping the psyche. With Thoughts for the Times, Freud significantly extended the material that he engaged with, turning from individual psychology to issues of politics, culture, and war. The occasion for this turn was obviously the First World War. This conflict, the first modern industrial war, was a traumatic event that not only resulted in mass death and destruction, but also challenged and undermined many long-standing beliefs and paradigms of thought, necessitating new approaches to understand what was happening and what might follow. Freud's radical psychoanalytical take on war and violence was one such attempt to bring creative new approaches to this pressing issue in order to understand the world anew. This has been the inspiration for our own Thoughts for the Times series. We wanted to create a space where leading thinkers and creators could bring new approaches to the study of the most pressing issues of our time. I'm so pleased to have two such people here with us today who will help us to grapple with the meaning and consequences of the Russo-Ukrainian War, a conflict that has not only resulted in mass death and destruction, but has also challenged and undermined many of the geopolitical verities of our time. As I mentioned a moment ago, Irina Starovoit is the inaugural JCW Writer-in-Residence. She's a professor of cultural studies at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, and as of last week, also writer-in-residence at Oxford University in England. She's a poet, essayist, broadcaster, translator, organizer, administrator, and many other things besides. Irina will be in conversation with Andrew Wernick. Andrew is a professor emeritus of cultural studies at Trent. He was long-standing chair of the Cultural Studies Department and the founding director of the Methodologies graduate program, which has since morphed into the Cultural Studies MA and PhD. He's the author of many books and articles that explore sociology, cultural theory, theology, and politics, including Shadow of Spirit, Religion, and Postmodernism. Irina and Andrew are not only intellectual interlocutors, but have also been friends since 2001, when Andrew began to travel to Ukraine in order to consult on the post-Soviet era reform of graduate education in the humanities and social sciences, to help build MA and PhD programs in cultural studies and sociology, and to teach and lecture as a visiting professor. If I'm not mistaken, it was 11 years ago this year that Andrew participated in an initiative put on at the Ivan Franko National University titled University Dialogues. So this event honors the past while looking ahead to the future. Two final notes. I would like to thank the generous donors whose financial contributions made this event possible. The Dean's Office at Trent Durham, the Dean's Office at Durham College, the Department of Cultural Studies at Trent, and the Department of English Literature at Trent. Thank you for your support. Finally, I would like to dedicate this event to Yevhen Huilevich. Yevhen was a dear friend of ours from Lviv, Ukraine, a culturologist, poet, philosopher, photographer. Even though he had no military experience, Yevhen volunteered for military service when the war began. He showed himself to be extremely competent in battle and was promoted. He served in many of the hottest theaters of war, including the fight for the liberation of Kherson. Most recently, he was present at the Battle of Bakhmut, a town that many of you now know by name. It's the site of some of the fiercest fighting since the Second World War, and the site where Yevhen was tragically shot and killed by a sniper. I'm positive that he would have loved today's discussion, so this is dedicated to him, in memoriam. Vichnaya pamyat. And now, please join me in welcoming Irina Starovoit and Andrew Wernick.
So we are about to start our own Thoughts for the Times. And when thinking about the location and context of Sigmund Freud back in 1915, it crossed my mind that my ancestors actually shared the citizenship with him. They were all citizens of Austria-Hungary, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was crumbling and actually ceased to exist by the year 1918. So his thoughts were forward-looking, but his thoughts were equally disturbing and in a way, in certain portion tragic, as probably our today's talk will be. And the other side of this is that Sigmund Freud actually ended up as a refugee fleeing the Nazi regime, and his last years were spent in London. So unfortunately, his thoughts about the times and the war were unfinished in both ways, that the war, which they were calling the World War, was not the only one, and he was destined to live into the Second World War, and he saw the other tragedy unfolding.
One thing occurs to me just to recall my first visit to Lviv, which is an extraordinarily beautiful city, and its architecture is very much influenced by the last decade of the 19th century, and in the Austrian style. It's kind of a Belle Epoque, etc. wonderful place. Two things I want to mention. We go back to my first visit to Lviv, which was in 2001. The first is that I think my very second visit was for a meeting in September 2001. The meeting was due to happen on September the 12th. I was due to fly on September the 11th. I remember getting up that morning, about to go to the airport. I turned on the television and I saw the planes crash into the Twin Towers in New York. And I had an amused conversation with colleagues in Lviv. I phoned immediately and said, switch on the television. I can't come because there were no planes. The reason I mention this is because 9/11 is regarded as a turning point certainly in Western history, certainly in American history, but more generally in global history. And now in 2014, and again, last February, we have another turning point. And I certainly, many others, are inclined to think that that the war that has happened, the invasion that has happened by Russia of Ukraine, constitutes a very important global turning point. Perhaps it shifts not only the geopolitical paradigm, but maybe it also shifts the way we think about war. We no doubt cannot exceed anything that Sigmund Freud said, but we have new thoughts because of new history. And Irina and I have been talking about this for some time. We've obviously shared many conversations about Ukraine itself, but that's a sort of backstory to this conversation. One last very small thing. A project that we engaged in through the 2000s in Lviv was under a title that Irina conjured up, which was Old Cities, New Identities. One of the extraordinary things about Lviv was that despite all the wars it had been through in the 20th century, it was architecturally intact. All that had changed was that the population wasn't there. We coined this phrase, the neutron bomb effect, a kind of nuclear explosion that would only destroy people, but would leave the buildings intact. But now we see something completely different. We see destroyed cities. Lviv has mercifully not been bombed very much, but we've all seen pictures of the cities in Lviv that have been reduced to complete rubble. So we're in a different moment. It's like we're no longer in the neutron bomb effect. We're in something even worse. We're in some kind of major destructive moment. At any rate, I just wanted to say those couple of introductory things. If I may, I want to ask Irina to expand on a thought that she had recently. I thought was extraordinarily important, and it follows from the memorial for Yevhen. It was just a line in an email. She said, "Well, we have to move from tragedy to epic. We have to move from a narrative of Ukraine as a tragedy to a narrative of Ukraine in this moment as an epic." And I wanted to invite Irina to share a few thoughts about that.
Yes, this is obvious that the last 13 months, as people in many countries would say, and in last 400 days, I would say, because we Ukrainians count this war day by day and night by night, and every day is already a small win every next day, every next morning. I would say that, yes, the tragic rhetoric and the tragic experience, near-death experience, was surrounding us and penetrating into people's lives. If I only would mention that as of the year 2022, Canada and Ukraine roughly had almost the same population of about 40 million people. And of these 40 million people now, at least 7 million are outside of Ukraine in the status of international refugees. Not less than 7 million are internally displaced people. and at least 3.5 million people are now homeless. Their domiciles are destroyed to the point that they would not be recovered. They have to be built from the scratches anew. So if you think about this physical destruction which penetrates as far as to healthcare facilities, educational spaces, kindergartens and schools, of course, power stations and many other infrastructural objects, bridges, you also can understand that we are in really, really dire situation now. And of course, it all started back in 2014 when it was not an all-out invasion, but it started with the destruction of Crimean Tatar community and self-government on the Crimean Peninsula. And we had this very important introduction by Ganga. And I only want to point that both Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians are the first nations on their own lands. These are not newcomers. These are not necessarily people who somehow invaded the land or colonized the land and stayed there. No, they were in the same sports or almost in the same sports for many centuries along. And this is really the fact which has to be acknowledged in the context of today's meeting. So we Ukrainians living through tragic history, living through the catastrophe, and our land was already nicknamed by the historian of the 20th century, Timothy Snyder, the Bloodland. So it has already enough tragedy behind. And there were so many aspirations in the society, there were so many aspirations in intellectual community just to jump out of this tragic narrative already at the beginning of the 21st century. We have overcome that. We have probably to start anew in many ways because the future promised to be better, because the Cold War is over, and probably in this part of the world there should be no major conflict. For what sake? With whom? We are surrounded with quite normal neighbors, and it's true that even in circa 2014, Ukrainians were not expecting the blow from Russia directly, and many Ukrainians themselves, under the spell of Russian propaganda and very effective social media tricks, let's say, they were unsure whether Russia is really interfering with our state. Is Russia really out for the invasion, or it only backs some local separatists, or what actually is going on? But after the annexation of Crimea, illegal and legal, yes, because Russia proclaimed that they actually are adopting Crimea into the under the constitution of Russian Federation as a new unit, as a new entity within a federation. So after that, there was a great astonishment on the side of many Ukrainians, especially who had families in Russia, who were raised in Russian language as their native, their mother tongue, and of those who were thinking about Russians as brotherly nation. That was the rhetoric, that was the narrative which has been in circulation for more than 70 years. And now I think that the whole context and the whole experience of that changed tremendously. So it's true that living through the catastrophe brings you knowledge, brings you affect, and brings you experience, which is very hard to digest, and it has to be articulated and it has to be reflected. But in order to be able to tell your story, you need not only intellectual effort, but you need sober mind. That need transform you into a stoic of a kind. You reclaim your agency when you are able to cope with the tragedy. And in glaring contrast to the Greek tragedy, in our open-ended history, it could happen this way, or it could also happen quite a different way. And my understanding now is that the tragic thinking suggests it's too late, it's all over. But epic thinking suggests something different. It's a back-breaking effort. It costs much civic heroism, but it's not too late. It's now or never moment. It's probably the finest hour in history, and you have to prove who you are. Can you live up to your values? Are there any potentialities in you, some internal resources that you can live up to your values? And just to finish on this note and to invite Andrew to share his thoughts, I would quote from Yevhen Hulevich Facebook diary, because while on the front line, he was capable to drop a couple of lines this week and that week. And a year ago, back in March 2022, he actually written these words: sharing and being generous is a wonderful natural origin of life. What was given to you out of love is easy to repeat, lovingly giving in return. We are now all sharing what we collectively give to each other, each in our own way, very differently. War unites us without exception. It makes no sense to look at Ukraine after the war with the eyes of the past. We are already changed. We are some other country. This new meaning gives everyone a new beginning, a new sense of the world, which will soon be ripened by proper understanding, word and deed. So let's not forget, in the midst of acute pain, despair, desolation, rage, or tears, to trust in this great sense of unity, which says that everything will be fine.
That's extraordinary words from Yevhen, which I'd never heard before. I want to add a couple of things. Just from my own experience of Ukraine before 2014, one of the things that I found rejuvenating since I was just about to retire was I hadn't sensed being in a place where there was a sense of optimism, creativity, elan, for decades until I went to Lviv. North America seemed like in a long happy depression since the 1960s, if you will. But there was a spirit, especially among, say, people under 40, that I came across in Ukraine that was quite inspiring. I couldn't put a finger on it because it wasn't particularly a political movement. It didn't have a name. But I wasn't surprised by the Orange Revolution in 2004 or 2005, when a contested, really a fraudulent election was challenged, and it led to a democratizing kind of movement. And then nearly 10 years later, when a series of kind of complicated political developments inside Ukraine led under the, I think Yanukovych was the president at the time, to a choice between whether Ukraine was going to move towards Europe in some kind of cultural and political sense, or whether it was going to stay within the Russian orbit. And it was as a result of a political movement that was catalyzed by this controversy that an enormous popular movement developed out of a thing called Euromaidan, started in Kiev, but it was throughout Ukraine. And in the end, Yanukovych was overthrown. There was a new constitution. And then the Russian response was, of course, to invade Crimea and to sort of semi-invade the eastern part of Ukraine. So my sense in the 2000s that there was some kind of creative, explosive movement under the surface proved to be correct when these events catalyzed it. This is to say that there was an optimistic sense of development into what they called post-Soviet times that was going on before last February. And it already, there was an energizing and a transformation really at a deep level of Ukrainian society and a sense of collective identity already in place. And the war has not stopped that. It has transformed it. It's mutated it, I'm sure. But there was already something positive, positive taking place. Now, let me just ask Irina whether she thinks this rather rosy reading of pre-2014 Ukraine accords with her sense of things. It's just to say that I don't think we're entirely in a new beginning, but we're in a new beginning, if you see what I mean.
Yes. If you ask me about this spirit and this, let's say, almost invisible atmosphere of the grounded optimism for the future and this new energy which was pumping out of people's initiatives on many levels, people who were first in their lives actually given the chance to travel to other countries, to meet other people, to compare the experiences, to learn languages, to get a good education after all. That was, yeah, I think that was very inspirational in many ways, on many layers. And the same thing as this war is multi-layered. It's happening not only on the surface, which we can see in the news, but actually it has some of it, portion of it has been like a pre-war experience, and it was already in hybrid format, in form of informational war, in the form of epistemic war, I would say, and of course the war about history and memory. I myself participated in a couple of projects on that. And what I observed is that by the end of 1990s, or at least by the beginning of the millennium, Russian society was soaking into the Soviet nostalgia. And what was really interesting for me, that this Soviet nostalgia was injected, was infused even to my generation, the generation which was in their, I don't know, 15 to 20 years old, so actually almost teenagers at the moment when Soviet Union was crumbling. And in my understanding, should be very enthusiastic about the new possibilities and the free world to which they are now invited as proud members and equals. In many ways, Russians were more equal in that world than we Ukrainians, because everybody across the border knew who Russians are, and hardly every 10 person I have been acquainted with when starting to visit some Western academia places, hardly every 10 person know what Ukraine actually is, who am I, what do I represent, and how to behave with me. And that's really interesting that nostalgia, we all know that it could be as of a kind of aesthetic idea, but it could be reconstructive, revanchist nostalgia. And the push button between the two is very soft. So actually, when you soak into the first kind of nostalgia, it's quite easy then to readjust or remode you into this other, more violent, more revanchist mood. And in Ukrainian case, it was quite a different history. And I was asking myself why. Probably I have at least part of the answer now, and probably some of people in the audience will either support or clash with me on this. Ukrainians were the ones who actually announced the referendum for independence from the Soviet Union. Seeing the situation with Baltic states, which proclaims their independence but had no referenda, and because of that, we're targeted by Soviet political power and even Soviet military power. They were threatened that what they are doing is a kind of illegal. And there was this tragedy in Vilnius in January 1991, when Lithuania was in principle almost a year after declaring its independence from the Soviet Union and living as a separate and independent state. but still was invaded with Russian tanks, and it all is happening under Gorbachev. And still 15 people were killed in the clashes between the military and the local protesters. So the fight was seized. The Russians actually taken themselves back. But I believe one of the arguments was that Gorbachev didn't want that he would be remembered as, for example, Chinese Communist Party leader is remembered for Tiananmen Square massacre. So he understood that the bloodshed will be big and it will go into the Western media, and it doesn't fit into the image of a big peacemaker and the Nobel Prize laureate and so on and so forth. So actually Vilnius escaped. But for Ukrainians and for many other people which were like of dissident mind about the belonging to Soviet Union, that was an important episode to understand. And that actually was a catalyst moment for other republics to rethink their presence within the Soviet Union and their perspectives. So from one side, in March, Gorbachev called for the new initiative, which should be the new the new legal document, the new legal basis for the reformed Soviet Union of more equal and more sovereign republics, but still united under the Soviet rule in Moscow. And at that very moment, only in 3 regions of Ukraine, in Chernobyl region, Lviv region, and Ivano-Frankivsk region, there was an extra question put to the questionnaire about this reforming of the Soviet Union. If for any case Ukraine would declare independence, would you be pro or contra of such a thing? And it's interesting that in all 3 regions, nevertheless, it was still a situation of censorship, self-censorship, KGB, and that all. The majority voted that probably they would be pro-independent if the situation arrives. But hardly even half of these people believed the situation will arrive a couple of months later. And then we had Putsch, the military coup or attempted military coup in the mid of August 1991 in Moscow. And after that, all the processes started to be very fast. And as early as on August 24, Ukraine proclaimed independence, which was voted within the parliament of Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and Ukrainian communists, which were like a couple of weeks ago would be scared even to imagine such a thing. They actually themselves voted for going away from Moscow. And that was a big surprise. But the biggest surprise was that the Second World War veteran and an important dissident thinker, political thinker of the time, the theoretician of physics by his academic background, Ihor Yukhnovsky, has taken the platform, has taken the mic in the parliament and said that our decision is historic, but it will be not solid enough if we would not announce the all-national referendum on this issue, because this is so an important issue for all of us and for the next generations. We have to know what Ukrainian people think. And he was almost attacked at that moment by Ukrainian dissidents because they thought, well, this is a betrayal. How could you say this? We don't know how Ukrainian people exactly would vote, and you are stripping us of the chance, which is really historic. But Yukhnovsky was persuasive, and the referendum was called. This referendum has taken place December 1st, 1991. And the turnout was more than 85% of the grown-ups entitled to vote, and the outcome was 92.6% for Ukrainian independence. The outcome was shocking for Gorbachev, and the outcome was shocking for Boris Yeltsin as well. So in the next couple of days, they had to make some decision. And actually, Yeltsin played it out for his own favor because Soviet Union later was dissolved and Gorbachev ended up as a president without a union. So there was no such a country anymore. And Yeltsin has stepped into his shoes and taken the advantage of being a successor of the failed state of the Soviet Union. But it's interesting to imagine that Ukrainians, they have slept the night after that was an unslept night because everybody wanted to know what the outcome would be. But more or less after that, Ukrainians were sleeping with a clear consciousness. We knew that we did right, and that was our common choice. And we share this unity that we really want to get rid of the Soviet Union because now it's soft. Now it has Gorbachev as its leader. But in a couple of years or in a couple of decades, should we expect somebody else to come and it would be more Stalin-like or more Brezhnev-like? We don't know. So actually that was a protective gesture in eyes of the contemporary Ukrainians. But for Russians and many others in the Soviet Union, I believe that was the night when they came up the next morning without their own country and felt like homeless, like something was stolen from them. And that's probably was a sentiment which was softly repressed with all kinds of hardships of the next years or probably even the next decade, and then has been softly uncovered and enhanced by Putin and Putinism. So actually, you have lost your country. You have not voted about that. You have no agency about that. So probably we have to think, how can we act? How can we get it back? How can we restore the glorious Soviet Union?
I wonder, one thing that strikes me in terms of that whole narrative, Irina, is that it wasn't only the Soviet Union that fell apart, but in some sense, the Russian Empire. And I think, outside Eastern Europe, Western thinking has been frozen for 100 years. In fact, I would say back to the beginnings of the 19th century, in just taking it for granted that Russia's legitimate sphere of influence went right across Europe. The partitions of Poland that happened in the end of the 18th century made this very clear. The movement of Russia south into the Balkans that led up to the Crimean War, which I've been reading about recently in the 1840s and 1850s, absolutely extraordinary events, which we can't get into now. Part of Cold War thinking has continued after the Cold War in the West in a number of paradoxical ways. The one is that, communism versus capitalism, that's been resolved. But we still have to acknowledge that that Russia's territory extends far west of Moscow, and it includes, for example, and most importantly, what is now Ukraine and Belarus. These territories were some of the earliest to be colonized by Russia. I think after it defeated the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth, and going back into the period of the 17th century and 18th century. So what's at stake in the Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian democracy is not only the remnants of the Soviet Union and how to move into post-Soviet times, but also how to move beyond the Russian Empire. And this is a huge problem for Russia itself and for people inside Russia. And obviously the people in charge in Russia now are the most extreme nationalists. They're not just nostalgic about the collapse of the Soviet Union and Brezhnev and whatever. they're nostalgic about Catherine the Great and I mean, all the way, all the way, and Peter the Great. I mean, in some ways, Putin somehow seems to think that he's a reincarnation of Peter the Great in some ways. So, well, that's one thing I want to say. And it also part of Cold War thinking through the Cold War in the West was that the movements which were against the Soviet Union from inside the Soviet Union and from inside the satellite countries of the Soviet Union were all right-wing nationalists. And that's still the narrative inside Russia. They still think of Ukrainian nationalism as ultra right-wing. That's why they call it Nazi. But clearly what has happened is something quite different. There's a new kind of civic nationalism, democratic nationalism. In fact, I'm not even sure it's nationalism inside the Ukraine. It's as if it's not only a war of national liberation, it's also a democratic revolution from within the whole Russian sphere of historical influence. And I mean, and to my way of thinking, this makes it a kind of a vanguard struggle in some kind of absolutely enormous sense that even goes beyond the immediate region of Eastern Europe and that part of the world. And I think that post-Cold War thinking has to acknowledge this reality. And I know that, I mean, Kissinger and that kind of realist school in American foreign policy have never acknowledged this. They've never really acknowledged that the Russian Empire was an empire, and that its perpetuation wasn't normal, but was pathological and dangerous. And so there are these accommodationists in the West who are still thinking of Russia as legitimately extending to Poland and beyond.
I can catch up here, and I can just go from the other direction into the same vein of the discussion. First of all, my explanation is that there was quite a well-equipped and well-founded field of Russian studies outside of Russia, which has developed immensely exactly thanks to the emigration, so-called white emigration after the First World War and after the revolution in Russia, which tend to be overthrown by counter-revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which then has been proclaimed the only right revolution, and after which White Army actually withdrawn and the Red Army won, and at least this part of the civil war inside the Russian Empire has been lost. And that's interesting that Lenin and later on Stalin, they actually recreated Russian Empire within the borders of the Soviet Union and even expanded on that. And after the Second World War, the sphere of influence, this notorious sphere of influence of the Soviet Union and Stalin himself expanded 200 or 300 kilometers into the West. And those countries which appeared on the political map after the collapse of the big land empires in Europe after the First World War, like after the collapse of Germany, after the collapse of Austria-Hungary, after the collapse of Ottoman empires and Russian Empire, these particular countries, I mean Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they found out themselves in the sphere of the Stalinist Europe. It means the socialist camp, or how would you call it? And it's not necessarily that they were opting for that. That's not necessarily, and we know that they were very happy with that. The outcome of the Second World War, however we would think about it from the perspective of 2023, was not very just outcome. It was not very just peace, and we now understand why. But at the same time, and it's important to say that Russian émigré professors, Russian émigré intellectuals who found themselves out of the Russia and probably later out of the Soviet Union, nevertheless, very often represented the worldview which was absolutely imperialistic. And my question to you and to other colleagues in Canada would be, how come that the state, which was imperial for many centuries, which was resurrecting and recreating its own empire with a big craft, even through the 20th century, is understood outside of Soviet Union and then outside of Russian Federation as an anti-imperial force, as a major anti-imperial force, the leader for the global South and other places in the world to fight the Western imperialism. And my understanding of that is that nevertheless, Russian emigre high intellectuals found themselves in the West in quite hospitable condition. Still, they had this nostalgia about the empire which is no more, or the empire which is changing not in the right direction. And they were anti-Western, even being in the West, which was very good because the Western academia and the Western social media like to be self-critic and like people who are critical. But at the same time, people like Solzhenitsyn, for example, they never been critical enough about the Russian imperialism. On the contrary, they were trying to recreate a lot of stereotypes and bad education driven from 19th century textbooks and 19th century articles about how Jews, for example, are betrayals of Russia, or how Ukrainians are betrayals of Russia. And I believe anti-Western sentiment is even more vibrant in contemporary Russia than anti-Ukrainian. And Ukrainians are seen as puppets in the hands of their warmongering West. And Putin was successful in trading the story that Russia was about to be invaded or threatened to be invaded by the Western powers. And that's why it was important to somehow stop this by dissolving the big war in Ukraine. Otherwise, the war would be on the Russian territory itself. So from one side, he is saying Ukraine is not Russia because now war is not on the Russian territory, he says. But from the other side, he is saying, no, Ukraine belongs to Russia, was Russian land for a long time, and will be for another century or many centuries. But the ingredient which is missing is civil society. Neither Russian imperialist thinkers of earlier times, like 19th century, 20th century, neither now, they give a small thing to the fact that Ukraine is not empty land, and Ukraine is not only a territory, that there are communities of community is inside this geographical space, and that these people are heirs of some historical and legal legacy. And for example, they were exposed to small episodes of parliamentarism, but still they were having their independent state and parliamentary republic between 1917 and 1921. And that these people were also part of the already mentioned Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was also a parliamentary country, at least for part of its history. Of course, it was only high-class parliament, but still there was a representative attitude to politics there, and there was a political discussion and political discourse, and a lot of participation. And Austria-Hungary turned parliamentary after 1848, and it was important that these local parliaments were for real, they were influential. And the most important thing which actually happened in Ukraine and did not happen in Russia, or happened just on the contrary, was decentralization of power. Nevertheless, Ukraine is not as big as Russian Federation and comprised not of so many units as Russian Federation. Decentralization in Ukraine after the year 2014 was taken very seriously. And local mayors and local elected powers they felt that they are really responsible for the people who delegated them this power. And it was important for them to prove that all together we can do better, and locally we can self-govern better than Kyiv will govern from afar. And these couple of years of freedom, these couple of years of self accountability changed so much in people attitudes towards the common thing, towards the social reforms and possibilities for bettering the society, that actually the optimism and trust was just blooming and booming, and nobody could exactly answer the question, what are the resources of Ukrainian resilience? The Ukrainian resilience in many ways is because we believe that we have to help to each other, and we are really helping to each other in need.
I mean, there's so much in what you're saying. I mean, one thing that jumps out at me from what you're saying is that the current Western, let me say, Bidenish rhetoric about this globally, this is all about a fight between democracy and autocracy, which I think is a really huge oversimplification, but it has something correct within it. When they say, in that rhetoric, when one says democracy or liberal democracy, one thinks of parliaments and elections. One doesn't think of civic society and self-government as something which is deeper into the society, or forms of a political body which are localized and decentralized. And you've used this term many times in your own writings, horizontal rather than vertical. But that emphasizes for me the importance in the kind of ideological, cognitive dimension, interpretive dimension of all this, how important it is to deconstruct all the verities that we have inherited from the Cold War, because I think they freeze thinking in all manner of ways in all manner of countries. The USSR, yes, could pose as anti-imperialist because of its official socialist rhetoric. This was always socialism in one country, incidentally, and so there was always something not quite forthright about the anti-imperialism. But regardless of that, it was possible for the Soviet Union to pose itself as anti-imperialist, and for the West to present itself as against communism and atheism. I mean, this is all through the 50s. This was a kind of a dominant rhetorical thing. Now there's still a polarity in the world left behind as a residue from that conflict, but now on the Western side, this is all about democracy. It is all about parliamentary democracy. Communism has disappeared as an enemy or as a fantasy. And on the Russian side, we're still left with anti-imperialism, and the West is imperialist. Although it's not Lenin's imperialism, I don't know what kind of imperialism they think it is. But it's a cultural war, and we've got all kinds of ideologies that had developed in the 19th century that have come back really virulently. The most important of which are to do with Eurasianism on the one side, and the kind of missionary position of Orthodox Russian Christianity on the other side. So that on the Russian side, the conflict in Ukraine is posited as not just against the West and Western imperialism and NATO expansion and all of that sort of stuff, but it's also against something satanic. The West as decadent, the West as a purveyor of anti-traditional values, the West as itself atheistic, indeed. So we've got this very strange rhetorical shift. And as I say, it seems to me the lesson we have to draw from this, if we're to see through the fog of cognitive war, as I would put it. We need to step back from this all these rhetorical constructions which mirror one another, and sort of analyze things anew. And part of the way to do this is to look forward and to see what's opened up. And part of it is to look back, and to look back beyond the 20th century, to see some of the frozen conflicts that have been, that are exposed as the ice melts, as the historical ice melts, and recognize some of these figures.
Maybe I need just to step in here for a moment and try to somehow mock or deconstruct a very bitter rhetoric, bitter for Ukrainians, that they were accepted better across European countries, in Great Britain, in Canada, and the US as refugees because they have some white privilege. And my understanding, and I think many of my colleagues will support me in that, that the people who are of different races and of different countries across the globe, they should understand that one of the important things within the Russian Empire was that people of the same faith, not faraway land, not some pagans or unbelievers, but people of the same faith, the Orthodox Christianity, and people of almost the same looks, they were colonized and put into slavery. In the late 18th century, the process was finished by Catherine the Great, but it started even earlier. And it was important that these people were free people before that, and they were well educated. We have historical demographers and historical sociologists which are saying that in the late Baroque time, let's say by the end of 17th century, there are observations of international visitors to Ukrainian land, to Cossack land, as it was called at the time, that they were astonished that not only all children are literate, but all women are literate. So there was no distinction between women education and male education. The people were literate by 70–75%. We know that when Russian Empire collapsed in 1918, and there was measurement how many people are literate on Ukrainian ground, only as little as less than 30% were literate. So the degradation which has taken place could be measured even in this respect. But of course, this was only basic literacy. But when you think about how our ancestors were enslaved by Catherine the Great, and then they were put to the very hard work with no rights, and they were treated as human bodies and nothing else. By 1861, the process of abolishment has been announced by the Tsar. But again, the abolishment came with very little land or no land at all. So people were stripped from any property, and it's very hard to be an effective farmer when you have no land. So that was an incentive for them to go to the biggest cities, to relocate and to start their life anew within the industrialization process of Russia. But this industrialization was going very poorly. We know that one of the mistakes of the Russian Revolution, socialist revolution, which was admitted by Trotsky, was that it has taken place in the wrong setting, because there was not enough working class in Russian Empire in order to support and sustain a socialist revolution. So actually the working class should be only invented, it has only to be created. And because of that, they were faking socialism, and they were faking socialism again with Ukrainian peasants. And as early as in 1930s, Stalin understood that without enslaving peasants back, he would not be able to finish his industrialization project. And because Ukrainian peasants strongly objected this collectivization, which was equal to almost in slavery, That's why they were targeted and then crushed with such a strong hatred. And they were crushed not by Stalin himself, but by the people who were coming from the big cities as representatives of working class, crush the peasants, which were outdated and backwarded and so on. So actually, we don't take into account that people were deprived of passports even. And only as late as under Khrushchev, Ukrainian peasants were given full citizenship and full citizen rights, including passport and the right to travel inside their own country. So like my father was not entitled to go to the university in the city within Ukrainian Soviet Republic because he was officially of the peasant ancestry, though he was from the teaching family, but still. And just because Khrushchev abolished this, he was able to enter the university and to start a new life. These facts are absolutely not present in the average consciousness or average knowledge and erudition of the very well-educated specialists on Soviet times, on Russia Empire, and all kind of people who know all kind of figures and all kind of economic and statistics and sociology and so on, and are very well educated about what socialism was and was not. They have no idea about the living dimension of this history, and that Ukrainians or Belarusians have none white privilege, never, and probably still have none. Hopefully, we would not develop any privileges. Our society now is constitutional, it's equality for all, and it's a very inclusive society. And the last interview I saw from Mariam Nayem, the Afghani Ukrainian, a young, very interesting woman and cultural entrepreneur, who says to the right party representative, right-wing party representative, Irina Farion, I am no less Ukrainian than you. You probably are Ukrainian, I'm Afghan Ukrainian, but I'm not less Ukrainian than you. And she sustained huge wave of support, because actually Ukrainians now, we are equally inclusive as many other nations, like Canadian nations now. We are intaking more and more people, and we are, let's say, converting them to be Ukrainians.
I mean, there's more than one kind of imperialism. And one of the things about the Russian Empire, it was a land empire, and it wasn't involved in the scramble for colonies in Africa or in other parts of the global South. So it's barely recognized as imperialism in terms of the self-critical rhetoric and self-critical understandings that Western countries are rightly going through now. So they have their own history of slavery and of empires and of scramble for colonies and all the terrible stuff that's left behind. But in that picture, it's very hard to conceptualize what has happened on the Eurasian landmass, particularly, particularly from Russia moving west. One needs a new political vocabulary. There's one other thing that leads me to want to explore with you, which is the nature of the aggressive ideology that's coming from Russia and which is helping to fuel the war. I mean, we can all see that there's not just an invasion, there's unimaginable cruelty, there's destruction, there's a demonization of the people being attacked. And this is coming not only from the soldiers, who are very often from the most backward parts of Russia, but also coming from the leaders. And I just want to mention one thing I came across when I reading about the ideological history of contemporary Russia some 2 or 3 years ago, which was that there was a meeting in Italy at one point between Alexander Dugin, who's one of the most important ideologues of Eurasianism, and supposedly quite influential on at least a part of the military and perhaps on Putin, And Steve Bannon, who is sometimes called Donald Trump's brain, who's an international traveling far-right networker. And he and Dugin apparently had a meeting which wasn't recorded, but was then written about afterwards, suggesting that there are some links, some ties, some resonances, let's say, between the kind of extreme right-wingism you get today in Russia and the kind you get in the United States and other countries. And what's again, I think we have to escape from some of the models we've inherited from the 20th century. Is this fascism? Is this neo-fascism? Is the term fascism even useful as a way to understand these ideological complexes? At any rate, we have this new form of combination of big capital T traditionalism, anti-modernism in a certain way, and good versus evil rhetoric and demonologizing of different cultural areas, and it's become a very important influence on contemporary populist movements. And I think it's both dangerous and we need to understand it. But what's been let loose in the world is something unbelievably destructive. And we see it playing out in Ukraine. There's something excessively negative, nihilistic about this. And I think that's something we also need to grasp in terms of understanding the situation that Ukraine finds itself in and what this represents on a global stage.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this almost every couple of days, and there is no one answer. Probably there are not too. We have too little access now to the real sources in order to understand the decision making and the distortions of the commands which are happening on the ground. But we know, for example, that today is exactly a year since Kyiv battle was won and Bucha and Irpin were liberated, and we discovered what actually has been happening on the occupied areas of Ukraine within a couple of weeks, how much cruelty has been inflicted and how much dehumanization actually has been going on. So that was not only the genocidal rhetoric on the Russian side, but actually the way some they behaved as they really wanted to implement at least part of this genocidal rhetoric. And it was not only the gray zone and illegal zone, but these soldiers and officers and people people with guns, they knew that they would not be punished for that. So actually, this is what Russia actually wants. This is what they have to deliver: the fear, the destruction of a on the brink of the imagination, and the more rape and cruelty, the better. So what can I say about the nihilism? This is a good observation that Russian state now is rather a political experiment in that way that first in human history, for so many years, secret services started to be the ruling power of the country for so long. It's not only the military coup within the country, it's rather the secret services coup who seized all the power and who started to create a kind of a pyramid of incredible cruelty and this philosophy that the might is right and always right. If you just take into account how many people were killed, poisoned, mutilated within the first years when Putin just came into power, you could be just astonished. Even on Ukrainian ground, we had these cases. Well, you have mentioned Orange Revolution. Orange Revolution was about the pro-Western candidate, which was actually poisoned, almost poisoned to the death by Russian secret services. It was not possible to announce that loudly back in 2004. And Yushchenko never named his poisoners, but Navalny now is able to name his poisoners. And these are people from the same structures, and they behave in the same scenarios. These scenarios are well known by now. And in this respect also, you're right when you say that Cold War was never over, but it was not only never over in minds of the Western politicians or in Western academia and social structures, but it has been entirely over in Russian political establishment and economical establishment as well. So this hostility and this negativism was present there almost from the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was flourishing further in the next decades and was upgraded many times. And it's interesting that the Western countries were almost aware about that, but they were ready to exchange this awareness for the comfort zone, because of the cheap gas and oil, because of some other important things which were supplied by Russia, including the dirty money, the London debt. It was useful not to pay too much attention. Those certain signals were very strong that the agents are penetrating the Western institutions and that they do a lot of work in order to export the chaos, export the hostility between right and left, between pro and contra, between this candidate and that candidate supporter. So the radicalization in democracy, in Western liberal democracy, get out of the lid, out of the scale as it was in the decades before. But another important thing is that I don't quite see that Russian society as a whole supports this war heavily. I can't see that enough by now. But what I see, that they don't believe anything, that they are in the nihilist situation now. They don't believe Putin enough, probably now less than before, but they don't believe Ukrainians, for example, because we are the enemies, and they don't believe you, and they don't see that there are many Wests. They see only that there is one West, and this West is consolidated against them. And when I would be asked about the situation now, like 10 years ago, when Nemtsov still was alive, I would predict that probably Russia has chances and there would be some Gandhi-like movements and maybe something like that could be done, that the Russian power will be overthrown peacefully. But now I don't believe in that, because the state, which is so cruel that it can send hundreds of thousands of citizens, grown-ups, to go to kill and to be killed, and give nothing about that. So they have a scale of killing which is 10 times, they have casualties which are 10 times higher than Afghanistan war, which lasted for almost 10 years for them. And for them, it's not enough. So in this way, there is this understanding that probably this war is a kind of a sacred war. So we will sacrifice even more people, even more lives, even more resources. We are ready to pay the check for this war just to prove to ourselves probably that Russia is mighty, that Russia is strong, then Russia would not surrender or back up somehow on this issue. So this will be a long and exhaustive war. And if somebody thinks that Putin will be quite rational about it, no, he was not rational when he started this war. And I think he would not be rational to stop this war. He would not stop until he is stopped. And this is the problem. This is the final point to which we have somehow to go in this discussion.
I mean, it strikes me, if it's a sacrificial war, it's not that in a religious sacrifice, one gives the finest things to the gods. One gives up the most valuable. And one of the things that's appalling about the way the Russians are fighting this war is that they are sending they're sending the most brutalized people to fight the war and to be just cannon fodder. I mean, besides the Wagner group and sending prisoners in exchange for their freedom, they can go and be killed on the front. There are ethnic minorities.
You don't see many people who are ready to be mobilized to the war. You don't see thousands and thousands of volunteers on the Russian side. No.
Exactly. So there's something incredibly cynical about this sacrifice that's taking place. And what I find very hard to understand is how this can be blessed by ecclesiastical figures, by the role that Kirill is playing as head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I remember reading about when the Moskva, the big centerpiece of the Black Sea Fleet was launched. It was blessed as a kind of a holy instrument of war by the church. And so something which looks to us as just evil is blessed as something good, as kind of as sort of a divine instrument from the other side. And this is so hard. This is so hard to understand or to recognize, and yet it's part of what gives the war a good conscience, I guess, for at least some people in Russia, and it's very, very hard to challenge. One of the things that strikes me about the Soviet Union is that it froze its previous history. It froze its monsters, just like a mammoth could be frozen in the tundra, and then climate warming, you suddenly see the bones of this huge animal, and that's how it looks to me about, for example, with respect to the most militant traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, it's standard for Russian Orthodox believers to refer to Catholics as heretics, and this goes back 1,000 years, right? I mean, yes. It goes back to the iconoclastic controversy. So there's a kind of an archaic religious history which has surfaced, and which is part of this incredible mixture.
Yeah. Just mind you that Ivan Mazepa, late Ukrainian hetman who was trying to withdraw Ukraine from Russian Union and Russian domination back in 1709, he lost his battle together with the Swedish king near Poltava, and he was anathemized since then till now. Every year they repeat the anathema. And another important thing that, for example, Ukrainian Catholics, why they are so dangerous, again, because they are the westernized part of Ukraine. So everything which is related to West probably is not only negative, but it's evil and has to be crushed as an evil with some sacral powers. But another thing is, I believe, that Stalin not only has not been somehow deconstructed enough, Stalin and Stalin's cult, the Stalinism has not been deconstructed enough, but was reinstalled during Putinism time. And when you think about Lenin mummy in the Red Square, it's still there, and it's still the cult of the dead. And it's, yeah, so there are many layers here as well. And as much as I understand, Putin himself now has an opinion that his power is sacral. So anything which is somehow challenging his power should be an evil. That's why he himself thinks that he is running a sacral war. But I hope that the rest of the world, which lives in 21st century, would not be transported back to medieval times. And I believe that if even Russia is such a powerful state with a nuclear weapon, but still, is it possible that medieval-like state will be, after this war, potentially a nuclear power? I hope not. And for me, this is now an existential question for the globe, for all those 141 countries who actually voted in the UN against this aggression, and in order this war would be stopped and the peace would be restored and the justice would be restored.
A huge historical question that this leaves, and we have to ask it, is after the war, can there be reconciliation? There's been so much injustice done. How would it be possible for Ukrainians and Russians, however defined, to be able to coexist? How long will it take? What sort of process is involved? People talk about we want a peace or a just peace, and what could that look like, and how can that be possible given what has happened?
Yeah, this is a rhetorical question for now, I think, because the war is not over and the justice has not been restored.
Can we pause that question? I hate to intervene and play the disciplinary role. My dear friends, you've such a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation, but time is ticking on. So I wanted to make an appearance and to say that if people have questions, now would be the time to post them and pose them. You can post them to the chat of either Zoom or YouTube, and we will pass them on to our interlocutors. I can leave you to debate the issue of peace, a just peace. I was going to ask a question which I think is related, which is about the future. I mean, we've talked a lot about the historical roots of the contemporary war. We've talked a lot about the way that it's being waged in the moment. But the full title of our talk was Thoughts for the Times, the War and Beyond, right? Which is in itself interesting. I mean, there was an issue of the title initially being the War and After, and then subsequently the War and Beyond. So I wonder if we could turn a little bit to this issue of the after or the beyond to the war. Irena, when you had a conversation with us at the first event that you appeared at the very end, you mentioned that your students refer to you as Vitamin H because of your hopefulness. And I wonder, are you still hopeful? Are you hopeful for the future, for the beyond? I mean, do you imagine what that beyond might be like? So I'll leave that as a first question. Again, I invite the participants to ask questions as well, and maybe we can move into that sort of final phase of our time together this afternoon.
If I may, speaking about the future is an important exercise. It's energetically and even mentally very hard for Ukrainians now to think about and beyond the war, because it's ongoing and threatening, and we're having funerals after funerals, and we have so many damages around us and inside us. So from one side, I understand that almost every damage to Ukrainian society is equally applicable to Russian society. We are losing our people, they are losing their people. We are losing our security. They also are insecure now. We are discussing how can we live after this war, and they also should be very disturbed, and I think they are about this. And the demography will be targeted, the economy will be targeted, the political prospects will be very dark for Russia after this war. With Ukrainian case, what do I understand and what I can break out into some logical scheme or some rational arguments. As much as I understand, we are a grassroots society, democratic society, and we are exemplary now for very healthy self-organization. And people who sacrificed so much already with not intention, right? We were not closing this war. We were not asking for this war, but this war came to us. Now we have sacrificed so much that we probably would like at least prove to the dead that that was not in vain, and prove to ourselves that we all together have the potential and have the good advice how to rebuild everything, but to be honest, not to rebuild, but to build anew, to bounce back and to build back anew. When I say build, it doesn't only mean temporary shelters. I also mean social institutions, educational institutions, healthcare system, all kind of things which were lumpy or were not perfect or were in crisis before this big war. All them will be restarted. But how? They will be restarted with people who sustain their profession during the big war. When you just think that our medical doctors and medical sisters and brothers, they were operating and giving health care under such a big pressure, and they still went through all the blackouts of this winter. As a society, we were told that our fighters are keeping the front on the zero position. This is very important. This is essential. But you, dear, stay strong in the rear and keep the country running, keep the society supported. So the railways should run, the education should run, the medical segment should run. And it all was as such. If you think about our power plants, which were targeted so many times, and all these emergency services, which were at the place right 10 minutes or 15 minutes after the attack. Very often there was a re-attacking and some of them were targeted and killed on the spot. But nevertheless, they were doing their job. And the electricity was restored to the power grid in 24 hours, sometimes in 48 hours, but no longer. So actually, as infrastructural unit, as societal unit, and as economical unit, Ukraine now is more resilient than at any moment in its history. And we all went through this together. And this togetherness is a great resource, because we always talk about human capital as a major capital for the 21st century. So if you ask me about the quality of human capital of today's Ukraine, I believe for many reasons it's one of the best on the S. So because of that, all these people together, they are great source of inspiration and great source of hope. And as I have already stated this in my previous talk, in my generation, there was a lot of disappointment and a lot of impatience that Ukraine is not developing fast enough. We would not wait, we would go abroad and probably stay abroad. Now it's quite vice versa. Of course, many people left and will be integrated in other places, but many people stayed, and they stayed with such a great resolution and with such a with such power of promise that this will be the new country for my children and grandchildren. And I think Ukrainians now, unlike Russians, they have no nostalgia for the past, because there is no this episode in the past in which we would like to return, fortunately or unfortunately. But we all want to see this country, how it will be in 2050, let's say. If you ask me about Yevhen Hulevich, probably his last words in his last interview were that, of course, I know the threat is very big. Of course, I know I could be killed, but I would like to live just for one sake. I would like to see Ukraine, how it will be in a couple of decades from now.
Andrew, any thoughts from you? I mean, do you care to play the role of soothsayer? You know, what are you hopeful? Are you hopeful for the shape of the international order or this geopolitical transformation that might come out of the war?
I used to be short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. I just see things very cloudy now. I mean, part of what the invasion has done is to poison the international communications, international cooperation, and the human species has never before needed more urgently to be able to cooperate. And that's I'm thinking of climate change and the refugee crisis, all manner of things which require some kind of international cooperation. So I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about that, but I know that creates a sense of necessity a necessity for people to cooperate and therefore to sort out their problems. As for this one, I don't know a lot. I mean, it's hard for me to be as optimistic as I was about Ukraine when I was there in between 2000 and 2012, when all I could feel was the lift. At the same time, that gave me a long-term sense of optimism about what Ukrainians could do and what Ukraine could be. I mean, one optimistic thought. There used to be an old biblical notion of the Jubilee, which was actually institutionalized at one point. Every 7 years or every 49 years, all debts would be cancelled. One of the features of a situation where there's been an erasure, a destruction, and still a will to rebuild, is that all kinds of internal debts, not only economic ones but moral ones, are in some sense cancelled. We start again. All the whatever internal resentments and injustices may have been felt in Ukraine, I think have been overwhelmed, swept away, perhaps cleaned in a kind of grand jubilee. So from the point of view of what I would call the gift economy, that gives me some real optimism. Where I'm less optimistic is how on earth things regionally can sort out, and how what I would call the Russia question can be resolved. My optimism is that there would be an uprising in Belarus, and that when we would get rid of Lukashenko and that regime, because I think that would really shift the relation of forces in that part of the world mightily. So I still have some regional optimism, but it depends on these complicated political things that are very hard to read from this point of view.
Well, perhaps on that note of ambiguity, we will bring things to a close with the lovely notion of the Jubilee still in mind, to give us some hope and optimism moving forward. So I want to thank both of you, Irena, Andrew, for a lovely, wide-ranging, deep and profound conversation. You've given us so many things to think about and to think with. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be here for this time with the two of you. And many thanks to our participants and attendees as well. I hope that this was also interesting and inspiring to you. So on that note, we will draw things to a close, and we will look forward to, Irena, seeing you for one more event in the fall, in your role as writer in residence for the Journalism and Creative Writing program, and we look forward to hopefully seeing many of you as well out there in the audience for this event upcoming. We will be in contact with you for that event in September. So take good care, everyone.